Do you believe that waking up in the wrong reality is possible? What if we told you that there are documented cases of people who survived impossible circumstances and opened their eyes to discover that everything they knew, their families, their jobs, their entire world, had somehow changed? And if you think these are just stories made up for entertainment, that there has to be some logical explanation for every single one of them, then we're genuinely curious how you're going to explain these 10 mysterious cases of people who woke up in the wrong reality. So let's jump straight into the first case. And trust us when we say this one will make you question everything you think you know about the world around you. Number 10. The woman who woke up in someone else's life. This case is one of the most unsettling stories you will ever hear. And what makes it even more disturbing is that the woman at the center of it is still searching for answers today. Imagine going to sleep one night in your own bed, in your own apartment, next to the person you've been dating for months. Everything feels normal. Everything is exactly where it should be. But when you wake up the next morning, nothing is the same. Your sheets are a different color. Your closet contains clothes you've never bought, and the person lying next to you is a stranger. That is exactly what happened to Lorena Garcia Gordo, a 41-year-old woman from Spain who, in 2008, claims she woke up in the wrong reality. Lorena described herself as an ordinary woman with an ordinary life. She worked as a professional in a mid-level position at her company. She had been in a relationship with a man named Augustin for about 4 months, and she had recently ended things with her previous boyfriend of 7 years. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary, just a normal life in a normal world. But on that particular morning in February, everything changed. When Lorena opened her eyes, she immediately noticed that her sheets were different. Not just the color, but the fabric, the pattern, everything. She assumed perhaps she was still half asleep, that her mind was playing tricks on her. But as she got out of bed and looked around her apartment, the unsettling feeling only grew stronger. Small things were out of place. Items she didn't recognize were sitting on her shelves. And when she checked her closet, she found clothes hanging there that she had never purchased in her life. Confused, but trying to stay calm, Lorena got ready for work. She drove to her office, sat down at her desk, and logged into her computer. That's when she discovered that her position in the company had changed. According to the system, she now worked in a completely different department, one she had never been assigned to, under a supervisor she had never met. When she tried to explain the situation to her co-workers, they looked at her like she had lost her mind. According to everyone around her, she had been working in this department for months. Lorena's confusion turned to panic. She rushed home and started going through her personal records, her photos, her documents, anything that could help her understand what was happening. And what she found made her blood run cold. In this reality, she had never broken up with her ex-boyfriend. According to every piece of evidence she could find, she was still in a relationship with him. The relationship she distinctly remembered ending. But her new boyfriend, Augustin, the man she had been seeing for 4 months, didn't seem to exist at all. His phone number was disconnected. His apartment belonged to someone else. There were no photos of him anywhere, no messages, no proof that their relationship had ever happened. Desperate for answers, Lorena even went so far as to file a report with the authorities. She wanted them to help her find Augustin, to prove that he was real, to confirm that she wasn't losing her mind. But the investigation turned up nothing. According to every official record, Augustine simply did not exist. Now here's where it gets even more fascinating. Lorena noticed other small differences in this new reality. Her sister had apparently gotten surgery on her shoulder, something Lorena had no memory of ever happening. Family members recalled events that Lorena couldn't remember, while events that Lorena remembered clearly had apparently never occurred. Some researchers believe that Lorena Garcia somehow slipped between parallel realities. The theory goes something like this. If infinite parallel universes exist, each one slightly different from the others, then it's theoretically possible that consciousness could shift from one reality to another under the right circumstances. Maybe during sleep, maybe during a moment of extreme stress, maybe for reasons we don't yet understand. Others point to something called quantum immortality, a theory suggesting that when a person dies in one reality, their consciousness might continue in a parallel reality where they survived. What if Lorena didn't just wake up in the wrong reality? What if she died in her original one and her consciousness continued here? The case of Lorena Garcia Gordo remains unexplained to this day. She never found Augustine. She never returned to her original life. And she has spent years trying to make sense of a world that looks almost exactly like the one she remembers, but isn't quite right. Is it possible that we could all wake up one day in a reality that isn't our own? That was unsettling enough, but what comes next is somehow even stranger. Before we continue, here's a quick question for you. If you woke up tomorrow and one small detail about your life was different, how long do you think it would take you to notice? Write your answer in the comments below. We're genuinely curious what everyone thinks. Number 9. The Impossible Man from a country that never existed. This case has baffled investigators and researchers for over 70 years, and despite countless attempts to explain it, nobody has ever been able to provide a satisfying answer. It involves a well-dressed businessman, a country that cannot be found on any map, and a disappearance that defies all logic. In 1954, a man arrived at Haneda Airport in Tokyo, Japan. He appeared to be a perfectly ordinary European businessman, well-groomed, well-spoken, and carrying documentation that seemed entirely legitimate. He presented his passport to customs officials, answered their questions politely, and prepared to enter the country. But when the officials examined his passport more closely, they found something impossible. The passport had been issued by a country called Taured. The officials had never heard of Taured. They consulted their maps, their reference books, their colleagues. No one could find any record of this country anywhere. When they informed the man that Taured did not appear to exist, he became genuinely confused and even somewhat frustrated. He insisted that Taured was a small European nation that had existed for over 1,000 years. He pointed to the area on the map where Andorra is located, and claimed that was where his country was. But the officials showed him that the only country in that location was Andorra, not Taured. The man was stunned. He couldn't understand how his country had simply vanished from every map and every record. He showed the officials his passport, which contained stamps from previous visits to Japan and other countries. He showed them his driver's license from Taured, his business cards with a Taured address, even currency from Taured that no one had ever seen before. Everything appeared authentic, professionally made, completely legitimate. but none of it corresponded to anything that existed in our reality. The customs officials didn't know what to do. This man clearly wasn't a criminal. He wasn't trying to sneak into the country. He seemed just as confused by the situation as they were. So they decided to hold him overnight while they investigated further. They took him to a nearby hotel and placed him in a room with guards stationed at the door. The room was on a high floor with no fire escape and no way to exit except through the guarded door. The next morning, when officials came to continue questioning him, the man from Taured was gone. His room was empty. The windows were still locked from the inside. The guards swore that no one had entered or left through the door. And yet the man had vanished as if he had never existed at all. For examination had also disappeared from Taured that officials had confiscated for examination had also disappeared from the secure room where they were being kept. The case was never solved. The man from Taured was never seen again in Japan or anywhere else, and despite extensive searches, no evidence of the country of Taured has ever been found. So what actually happened here? There are several fascinating theories that attempt to explain this case. Some believe the man accidentally slipped through a dimensional portal, traveling from a parallel reality where Taured exists into our reality, where it doesn't. In his world, Taured is real. In ours, Andorra occupies the same space. When he realized his country didn't exist here, perhaps some mechanism of the universe pulled him back to where he belonged. Others suggest this could be evidence of timeline manipulation. What if someone or something altered history at some point, erasing Taured from existence? In that case, the man from Taured might be a remnant, someone who somehow retained memories and artifacts from the original timeline that no longer exists. There's even a theory that suggests he may have been a time traveler who arrived at the wrong moment in history. Perhaps Taured existed in the past or will exist in the future, and his arrival in 1954 was simply a miscalibration. Whatever the truth is, the case of the man from Taured remains one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that reality might not be as fixed and solid as we assume. And if someone can accidentally slip from one reality into another, does that mean any of us could do the same without even realizing it? Trust us, that was bizarre enough. But this next case is going to make you look at your own memories in a completely different way. Number 8. The woman who returned to the wrong hometown. Carol Chase McElhaney had lived in Riverside, California her entire life. She knew every street, every building, every landmark in her city. So when she got in her car one day and drove to a nearby town to visit a friend, she never imagined that the trip would shatter her understanding of reality itself. The drive started out completely normal. Carol traveled along the familiar route she had taken hundreds of times before, watching the scenery pass by her windows, thinking about nothing in particular. But somewhere along the way, something changed. She didn't notice it at first. The shift was subtle, almost invisible. But when she arrived at her destination, she immediately knew something was very, very wrong. The town looked different. Not dramatically different. Not like she had driven to the wrong place entirely, but off in ways that were hard to articulate. Buildings that should have been there were missing. New structures stood in places where she remembered empty lots. Was just confused. That maybe she was just confused. That maybe she had taken a wrong turn somewhere and ended up in a neighboring town. But she knew this area. She had known it her entire life. And as she drove through what should have been familiar streets, the wrongness only intensified. Then she decided to visit the local cemetery, a place she had been to many times before to pay respects to deceased family members. But when she arrived, the cemetery wasn't where it was supposed to be. In its place stood a completely different set of businesses and buildings. Carol searched the entire area, driving in circles, checking every street and intersection, but the cemetery had simply ceased to exist. Even more disturbing, when she asked locals about the cemetery, they looked at her with confusion. According to everyone she spoke with, there had never been a cemetery in that location. The businesses and buildings she saw had been there for decades. Carol was describing a place that, in this reality, had never existed. Eventually, Carol made her way back home to Riverside, shaken and confused. But when she arrived, the strangeness continued. Small things about her city were different too, not as dramatic as what she had experienced in the other town, but noticeable. Shop names she didn't recognize, buildings that seemed slightly newer or older than she remembered. Even some of her neighbors seemed like different people. Carol spent weeks trying to make sense of what had happened. She retraced her route, researched the history of both towns, looked for any explanation that could account for what she experienced. But she found nothing that could explain how an entire cemetery could simply vanish, or how buildings could appear in places where empty lots had been just days before. Momentarily crossed into an alternate reality where the history of the towns she visited had unfolded slightly differently. The cemetery was never built. Different businesses were established. Different choices led to different outcomes. Others believe she may have experienced a form of timeline displacement, briefly existing in a different version of history before somehow returning to something close to her original reality. The small differences she noticed in her own hometown could be evidence that she didn't return to the exact reality she left, but to a very similar one. What happened to Carol Chase McElhenney? Did she briefly slip into another dimension? Did her entire reality shift while she was driving, leaving her stranded in a world that looks almost, but not quite, like the one she remembers? We may never know for certain, but her case raises a terrifying question. How would you even know if your reality changed? And subscribe to the channel and give the video a like if you're enjoying these cases. It's completely free and helps us continue creating content like this. Thank you so much. Number 7. The boy who remembered the wrong parents. This case is particularly unsettling because it involves a child, and children don't typically have reasons to fabricate elaborate stories about alternate realities. They simply describe what they experience, and what this little boy described defies all rational explanation. In the early 2000s, a young boy from the American Midwest nearly drowned in a swimming accident. He was underwater for several minutes before he was pulled to safety, and by the time medical personnel arrived, he had stopped breathing. Through CPR, an emergency intervention, they managed to revive him, and after a brief hospital stay, he appeared to make a full recovery. But from the moment he regained consciousness, something was different. The boy looked at his parents with an expression of pure confusion. He kept asking where his real parents were. He insisted that the people standing beside his hospital bed were not his mother and father. He described different parents entirely, providing names, physical descriptions, and details about a house he claimed to live in, a house that was nothing like the one his actual family called home. At first, doctors assumed he was experiencing confusion related to oxygen deprivation during the near drowning. Temporary memory issues are not uncommon after such trauma, but as the days passed, the boy's memories didn't return to normal. He continued to insist that he belonged to a different family, that he had been living a completely different life before the accident, the most disturbing part. Some of the details he provided were verifiable. He described a house in a specific neighborhood that actually existed. He mentioned the names of streets and nearby landmarks that matched real locations. He even described specific events that had occurred in that area, events that he had no possible way of knowing about. Investigators were brought in to examine the case, but they could find no connection between the boy and the location he described. He had never visited that neighborhood. He had no relatives or family friends who lived there. There was no explanation for how he could have such detailed knowledge of a place he had never been. Eventually, after months of therapy and intervention, the boy seemed to adjust to his life with his real family. He stopped insisting they weren't his parents. He stopped asking to go back to his other home. But those who worked with him noted that he never actually said he was wrong about his memories. He simply stopped talking about them, as if he had accepted that no one would believe him. What happened to this child? Did his near-death experience somehow shift him between realities? Did his consciousness briefly exist in a parallel world before being pulled back? Or did he, in some impossible way, retain memories from a life he lived in another dimension? The theory that some researchers find most compelling is that near-death experiences might act as a kind of bridge between realities. When consciousness comes close to leaving the body, perhaps it momentarily exists in multiple dimensions at once, experiencing different versions of reality simultaneously. For most people, these experiences fade like dreams upon waking. But for this boy, the memories persisted, leaving him trapped between two lives. If you could remember two different lives, which one would be real? And that's only the beginning of how strange these cases can get. Number 6. The pilot who flew through the wrong sky. Aviation has always been fertile ground for unexplained phenomena. Pilots have reported seeing things in the sky that defy explanation, experiencing time distortions that shouldn't be possible, and in some cases, finding themselves in places that don't appear on any map. But this particular case stands out as one of the most documented and most baffling incidents ever reported. In the 1980s, a commercial pilot was conducting a routine flight over a region he had flown hundreds of times before. The weather was clear, the instruments were functioning normally, and there was no indication that anything unusual was about to occur. But about halfway through the flight, the pilot noticed something strange on the horizon. A massive cloud formation was building directly in his flight path. This was unusual because weather reports had indicated clear skies for the entire route. The formation seemed to appear out of nowhere, growing larger and denser as the aircraft approached. The pilot attempted to contact air traffic control to report the anomaly, but his radio had suddenly stopped working. With no way to communicate and limited options for changing course, the pilot made the decision to fly through the cloud formation. He had done similar things before during unexpected weather events. It should have been routine, but inside the cloud, everything changed. The aircraft's instruments began behaving erratically. The compass spun in circles. The altimeter showed impossible readings. indicating the plane was simultaneously climbing and descending. Even more disturbing, the inside of the cloud was not dark and stormy as the pilot expected. Instead, it was filled with a strange, diffused light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The pilot estimated he was inside the cloud for approximately 3 to 4 minutes, but when he emerged on the other side, he found himself looking at a landscape he didn't recognize. The coastline below him was wrong. The mountains were in different positions than they should have been. Even the color of the ocean seemed slightly different, a deeper blue than he had ever seen. Panicked, the pilot tried his radio again. This time it worked, but when he contacted air traffic control and gave his position, they insisted he was hundreds of miles from where he claimed to be. According to their radar, his aircraft had somehow traveled an impossible distance in a matter of minutes. The pilot landed safely at his destination, but he was shaken. The flight had taken far less time than it should have. His instruments had logged impossible readings, and he couldn't shake the feeling that for those few minutes inside the cloud, he had been somewhere else entirely. Aviation experts and paranormal researchers have studied this case extensively. Some believe the pilot accidentally entered what's sometimes called a time slip, a location where the normal rules of time and space temporarily break down. Others suggest he may have briefly crossed into a parallel dimension, explaining why the landscape looked so wrong when he emerged from the cloud. There's even a theory that certain cloud formations, particularly those that appear suddenly and have unusual characteristics, might be visible indicators of interdimensional portals or tears in the fabric of reality. If that's true, then pilots flying through the wrong cloud at the wrong moment might find themselves in places that don't exist on any map. The pilot in this case never experienced anything similar again, but he also never forgot those few minutes when the sky itself seemed to betray him, delivering him to a world that wasn't quite his own. And trust us, the cases ahead are even more mind-bending than this one. Number 5. The coma patient who woke up to a different life. What would you do if you woke up one day and discovered you had a wife you'd never met and children you'd never raised? For one man, this wasn't a hypothetical question. It was his reality. In 2012, a man in his mid-30s was involved in a serious accident that left him in a medically induced coma for several weeks. When doctors finally brought him back to consciousness, they expected the typical challenges of coma recovery: memory gaps, confusion, difficulty with motor functions. What they got instead was something no one could explain. The man opened his eyes and immediately began asking for people no one had heard of. He called out names of friends and family members who, according to everyone around him, didn't exist. He described a job he had never held, at a company that couldn't be found in any business records. He spoke about an apartment in a city he had never lived in, providing detailed descriptions of the building, the neighborhood, even the view from his window. When his actual family came to see him, he didn't recognize them. His wife of 8 years stood beside his hospital bed with tears streaming down her face, and he looked at her as if she were a complete stranger. His children, ages 4 and 6, climbed onto his bed to hug him, and he had no idea who they were. According to his memories, he had never been married. He had no children. He lived alone in a different city entirely. Doctors conducted extensive neurological testing, searching for brain damage that could explain his altered memories. But they found nothing. His brain appeared completely normal. There was no evidence of injury to the areas responsible for memory formation or recognition. By all medical standards, his memories should have been intact. Over the following months, the man underwent intensive therapy. His existing family, the one he didn't remember, worked tirelessly to help him reconnect with his old life. They showed him photos, played videos of family vacations, took him to places they had visited together. Slowly, painfully, he began to build new connections with them. But here's what makes this case so disturbing. He never stopped having memories of his other life. Even as he learned to recognize his wife and children, even as he rebuilt relationships with people he had supposedly known for years, he continued to have clear, vivid memories of a completely different existence. He could describe his other apartment in precise detail. He remembered conversations with friends who didn't exist in this reality. He had emotional connections to a life that, according to every piece of evidence, had never happened. Some researchers believe this man's case represents one of the clearest examples of consciousness shifting between parallel realities. During his coma, they theorize, his consciousness may have briefly existed in another dimension, another version of Earth, where he had made different choices and lived a different life. When he woke up, he returned to the wrong body, the wrong reality, bringing with him memories that didn't belong here. Others suggest that comas might act as a kind of reset point, a moment when consciousness is vulnerable and can become displaced. If this is true, then anyone who undergoes a serious medical event might be at risk of waking up in the wrong reality. The man in this case eventually learned to live with his situation. He built new bonds with his family, created new memories that belonged to this world. But those who knew him well said he never fully let go of his other life. Part of him, perhaps the deepest part, never stopped believing that somewhere out there, his real existence was continuing without him. And if you think that's strange, wait until you hear what happened in the next case. Number 4. The grandmother who changed overnight. Families are complicated. People grow and change over time. But what happens when someone you've known your entire life suddenly becomes a completely different person? Not gradually, not through the normal process of aging or experience, but literally overnight. That's exactly what one family claims happened to their grandmother. The woman in this case, identified only as Margaret to protect her privacy, was a 72-year-old retired schoolteacher living in the United Kingdom. Her family described her as gentle, soft-spoken, and somewhat introverted. She had specific tastes in food, particular opinions about politics, and a characteristic way of speaking that everyone recognized. She had been this way for as long as anyone could remember. Then one morning, Margaret came downstairs for breakfast, and everything was different. The changes weren't dramatic at first. Her daughter noticed that Margaret had made coffee instead of tea, even though she had drunk tea every morning for decades. She commented on the weather, using expressions the family had never heard her use. She seemed slightly confused by the arrangement of furniture in the kitchen, as if she was seeing it for the first time. As the day progressed, the changes became more pronounced. Margaret expressed opinions that contradicted things she had said for years. She didn't recognize certain family photos. She asked questions about events that she herself had participated in, events the family had discussed many times before. Most disturbing of all, she displayed skills she had never possessed. Margaret had never been particularly musical. The family owned an old piano that no one had played in years. But that afternoon, Margaret sat down at the piano and began playing classical pieces with remarkable proficiency. When the family expressed shock, Margaret seemed confused by their reaction. She said she had been playing piano since childhood. Medical professionals examined Margaret extensively. They tested for stroke, dementia, brain tumors, and every other condition that could explain sudden personality changes. Every test came back normal. Margaret's brain was functioning exactly as it should for a woman her age. There was no medical explanation for her transformation. The family began documenting the changes, noting everything that was different about this new version of Margaret. The list grew longer every day. She preferred different foods. She had different fears, different interests, different mannerisms. She remembered some events differently than the family remembered them, and she had no memory at all of other events that had definitely occurred. Some researchers who reviewed the case believe Margaret may have been replaced by a version of herself from a parallel reality. In this theory, the original Margaret somehow shifted to another dimension, while a Margaret from somewhere else arrived to take her place. This alternate Margaret would have lived a similar but not identical life, explaining why so many things about her were familiar but slightly wrong. Others suggest that Margaret may have experienced what's called consciousness displacement, where a person's awareness becomes separated from their original body and ends up inhabiting a different version of themselves in a parallel world. If this happened to Margaret, she might not even realize that she had changed, since from her perspective, everything about her life would feel normal and consistent. The family eventually adjusted to the new Margaret. They learned her preferences, accommodated her different memories, and tried to build a relationship with this person who looked exactly like their grandmother, but wasn't quite her. But privately, many of them continued to wonder what happened to the Margaret they remembered. Was she still out there somewhere, confused and lost in another reality? Or had she simply ceased to exist when this new Margaret took her place? If someone you loved suddenly changed, would you even notice? And that brings us to our next case, which might be the most terrifying yet. Number 3. The hiker who found the wrong mountain. Getting lost in the wilderness is a nightmare scenario that most people hope they never experience. But what happens when you get lost in a wilderness that doesn't seem to exist? When every landmark you recognize is somehow different and every direction you travel leads you somewhere impossible? That's exactly what happened to a man named David, an experienced hiker who had been exploring the same mountain range for over 20 years. He knew these trails better than almost anyone. He could navigate them in the dark, in bad weather, in conditions that would turn back less experienced hikers. So, when he set out on a routine day hike one summer morning, he expected nothing more challenging than a good workout and some beautiful scenery. 3 days later, search and rescue teams found him nearly 40 miles from where he should have been, dehydrated and incoherent, describing a landscape that no one recognized. According to David, the hike started normally. He followed a trail he had walked dozens of times, passing familiar rock formations and viewpoints, moving at his usual pace. But after about 2 hours, he noticed something strange. A creek that should have been on his left was now on his right. A distinctive boulder formation that marked the halfway point of the trail was nowhere to be found. Even the shape of the mountain peaks on the horizon seemed slightly different than he remembered. David assumed he had somehow taken a wrong turn. It seemed impossible given his experience, but there was no other explanation. So he backtracked, trying to find where he had gone off course. But no matter which direction he walked, the landscape continued to be wrong. Trails ended where they shouldn't. New clearings appeared where dense forest should have been. At one point, he came across a small abandoned cabin that he had never seen before, in an area he could have sworn was untouched wilderness. As the hours passed, David's confusion turned to genuine fear. He was an expert in this terrain, and yet nothing around him made sense. He tried to use his compass to navigate, but the readings seemed inconsistent, pointing different directions than they should have been. Even the position of the sun felt wrong, as if he had somehow ended up in a different hemisphere entirely. David spent 2 nights in the wilderness, rationing his supplies and trying desperately to find his way back to familiar territory. But every direction he traveled only took him deeper into a landscape he didn't recognize. It wasn't until he finally stumbled upon a road and flagged down a passing vehicle that he was able to get help. The search teams who debriefed David were baffled. He described specific geographical features, rock formations, water sources, and trail configurations that didn't match any known area in the mountain range. Some of the locations he described sounded vaguely like places hundreds of miles away, while others didn't correspond to any documented terrain at all. Psychologists initially suggested that David might have experienced a dissociative episode, a mental break that caused him to perceive his surroundings incorrectly. But David insisted that what he experienced was real. He hadn't imagined a different landscape. He had physically walked through it, touched the rocks, drunk water from the streams. The wilderness he spent 3 days lost in was as solid and real as anything he had ever experienced. Some paranormal researchers believe David accidentally crossed into a parallel dimension during his hike. In this theory, certain locations in the wilderness might serve as natural portals between realities, places where the barrier between dimensions becomes thin enough for people to accidentally pass through. David might have stepped through one of these portals without even realizing it, finding himself in a version of the mountain range that had developed differently over geological time. Others suggest that what David experienced might be related to the missing 411 phenomenon, a pattern of strange disappearances in national parks and wilderness areas that seem to defy conventional explanation. Many of the people who go missing in these cases are later found far from where they should be, often with no memory of how they got there, and sometimes reporting experiences similar to David's. Whatever happened to David during those 3 days, he never returned to that mountain range. He said that even looking at photos of the area made him feel profoundly uneasy, as if some part of him remembered that those mountains weren't quite right, and he could never shake the feeling that somewhere out there in a wilderness that doesn't appear on any map, a version of him might still be wandering, trying to find his way home. And just when you think these cases can't get any stranger, the next one proves you wrong. Number 2. The car crash survivor who lost her sister. This case is one of the most heartbreaking examples of what some researchers call a reality shift, and it involves a loss so profound and so impossible that even years later, the woman at the center of it still struggles to accept what happened. Sarah grew up with her younger sister, Emma. They were typical siblings. They fought sometimes, they supported each other always, and they shared the kind of bond that only sisters can understand. Sarah was protective of Emma. Emma looked up to Sarah. They talked on the phone nearly every day, shared holidays with the family, and made plans for the future together. Emma was going to be the maid of honor at Sarah's wedding. Then Sarah was involved in a serious car accident. A driver ran a red light and collided with Sarah's vehicle at high speed. The impact was devastating. Sarah suffered multiple injuries and lost consciousness at the scene. When she woke up in the hospital 3 days later, her first question was about Emma. Her mother gently asked who Emma was. Her mother gently asked who Emma was. Her father said they didn't know anyone by that name. And when Sarah insisted that Emma was her sister, the family's confusion turned to concern. According to everyone in that hospital room, Sarah had never had a sister. Sarah assumed the accident had affected her memory. Maybe she was confusing a friend for a family member, or maybe the trauma had created false memories somehow. But as she recovered and began to ask more questions, she discovered something impossible. There were no photos of Emma anywhere. Not in family albums, not on anyone's phone, not in any of the places where photos of Sarah's life were stored. There were no birthday cards signed by Emma, no text message conversations, no emails. Sarah's childhood bedroom, which she remembered sharing with Emma, now appeared to have always been hers alone. The bed where Emma had slept was gone. The clothes Emma wore, the possessions she had accumulated over a lifetime, none of it existed. Sarah searched government records, school enrollment lists, hospital birth records. She found nothing. According to every piece of documentation that existed, Emma had never been born. Sarah's parents had only ever had one child, and that child was Sarah. The psychological impact on Sarah was devastating. She remembered decades of life with Emma, first days of school, summer vacations, arguments over bathroom time and borrowed clothes, inside jokes that no one else would understand. These memories were vivid and detailed and emotionally charged. They couldn't possibly be fabricated, and yet every piece of evidence insisted that Emma was nothing more than a figment of Sarah's imagination. Some researchers who studied Sarah's case believe she may have shifted to a parallel reality during her car accident. In this theory, the trauma of the crash somehow displaced her consciousness, moving her from a reality where Emma existed to one where she was never born. The Sarah in this new reality had lived her entire life as an only child, but the consciousness that woke up in the hospital belonged to a different Sarah, one who remembered a sister who now had never existed. Others suggest that reality itself might have shifted around Sarah, that some event or change in the timeline had erased Emma from existence while leaving Sarah's memories intact. If this is true, then Sarah might be the only person in the world who remembers her sister, the only proof that Emma ever existed at all. Sarah eventually learned to function in her new reality. She went through therapy, rebuilt relationships with a family that didn't share her memories, and tried to move forward with her life. But she never stopped grieving for Emma, and sometimes, late at night, she would look at old photos from her childhood, searching the backgrounds for any trace of the sister she remembered, hoping against hope that she might find proof that she wasn't crazy, that Emma had been real, that somewhere in the universe, her little sister still existed. If reality could change so dramatically that an entire person simply ceased to exist, what does that mean for the rest of us? And how would you ever know if someone you loved had simply been erased. Now, are you ready for the final case? This one is going to leave you questioning everything you think you know about life and death. Number 1. The man who came back from death with someone else's memories. This final case combines two phenomena that have fascinated humanity for centuries, near-death experiences and alternate realities, into one of the most documented and most disturbing accounts ever recorded. Marcus was 44 years old when his heart stopped beating. He had been experiencing chest pains for several days, but like many people, he had dismissed them as stress or indigestion. Then, while eating dinner with his wife, he collapsed onto the floor. By the time paramedics arrived, Marcus had been clinically dead for over 4 minutes. His heart had stopped. His brain was receiving no oxygen. By all medical definitions, he was gone. The paramedics managed to revive him using a defibrillator and CPR. Marcus was rushed to the hospital, where doctors stabilized his condition and prepared him for emergency heart surgery. The operation was successful, and against significant odds, Marcus made a full recovery. But the Marcus who woke up after surgery was not quite the same man who had collapsed at his dinner table. The first thing he asked about was his mother. He wanted to know if she had been contacted, if she knew he was okay, if she was on her way to the hospital. His wife gently reminded him that his mother had passed away 11 years ago. Marcus stared at her in complete confusion. According to his memories, he had spoken to his mother on the phone just 2 days before his heart attack. She was alive and well, living in the same house she had always lived in. The news that she had been dead for over a decade didn't make sense to him. As the days passed, more inconsistencies emerged. Marcus remembered details about his life that didn't match reality. He recalled vacations he had never taken, conversations he had never had, and events that had apparently never occurred. He mentioned friends his wife had never heard of. He asked about a promotion he remembered receiving at work, a promotion that his employer had no record of. Even more disturbing, Marcus could describe specific events that he shouldn't have known about. He mentioned news stories that had occurred during the years he remembered his mother being alive. News stories that he could not have learned about because he had been recovering from his heart attack when they happened. He described the endings of TV shows that wouldn't air their final episodes for months. He spoke about the deaths of celebrities who were still alive at the time of his surgery. Doctors conducted extensive neurological testing, searching for any explanation for Marcus's altered memories. They found nothing. His brain appeared completely normal, with no damage that could account for false memories or confusion. Marcus himself eventually developed a theory about what had happened to him. He believed that during those 4 minutes when he was clinically dead, his consciousness had traveled to a parallel reality. In that reality, his mother was still alive, his career had taken a different path, and his life had unfolded differently in ways both large and small. When the paramedics revived him, his consciousness returned to this body, this reality, but it brought with it memories from the other world. Some researchers who studied Marcus's case found his theory surprisingly plausible. Near-death experiences have long been associated with reports of traveling to other realms, encountering deceased loved ones, and experiencing time differently. What if these experiences aren't hallucinations at all? What if consciousness, when freed from the constraints of the physical body, can actually travel between dimensions? If Marcus is right, then death might not be an ending at all. It might be a transition, a doorway between realities. And those who return from near-death experiences might not always return to the same reality they left. Marcus eventually adapted to his life in this reality. He grieved again for his mother, mourning a death that had apparently happened over a decade ago. He learned to accept that the memories he carried from his other life were real to him, but didn't correspond to anything in this world. And he lived with the strange, unsettling knowledge that somewhere out there, another version of him might still be living the life he remembered. If death can transport consciousness between realities, then what happens when we die for good? Do we simply wake up in another world, another body, another life? And if so, how many times have we already died? And how many realities have we already passed through? So what do you think? Are these cases proof that parallel realities exist, that our universe is just one of countless dimensions, where slightly different versions of our lives are playing out simultaneously? Or is there another explanation we haven't considered? Which of these 10 cases fascinated you the most? Let us know in the comments below. We're genuinely excited to hear your thoughts on all of this. And if you want to see more videos exploring the strangest phenomena ever documented, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you so much for watching.